Launching a pawn to the center immediately stakes a claim and opens diagonals for queen and bishop development. Instantly contesting the center's influence, the knight assumes a dynamic outpost, preparing for central pawn advances. Asserting central control, c4 immediately contests the d5 square and prepares to expand on the queen side, creating dynamic tension. Challenging white's central grip, black immediately fights for space and activity. Stepping forward gains central space, but might invite black to blockade and develop quickly. Challenging white's central pawn grab opens a bold diagonal for the bishop and creates immediate dynamic counterplay. Developing the knight immediately contests the center and prepares kingside castling, a solid option in this symmetrical pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn chain, black embraces a cramped but resilient position, preparing to develop pieces for counterplay against white's central control. This pawn thrust strategically anchors the center, limiting black's knight and preparing a kingside initiative. Shaping a fianchetto to pressure the center, the pawn structure now dictates a more closed, strategic battle ahead. Unleashing the fianchetto, white immediately aims to shore up the queenside and develop the bishop to its most potent diagonal, anticipating a future kingside assault. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop, black immediately establishes a formidable diagonal presence, eyeing the d4 pawn and potentially preparing to contest control of the long light-squared diagonal. This proactive development ensures the bishop isn't left passive on the back rank and harmonizes beautifully with the e5 pawn. Developing the bishop to g2 completes the fianchetto, securing the bishop's long diagonal and preparing to castle kingside, a natural and harmonious setup within this king's Indian structure, solidifying white's central pawn presence while anticipating potential king safety measures. Securing the monarch amidst the central skirmish signals a commitment to development, aligning pieces for potential counterplay on the kingside, or a swift repositioning to support the central pawn structure's defense against white's encroaching pawns. Developing the knight to e2, while seemingly passive, skillfully bolsters the central pawn chain and prepares for a potential queenside expansion, while also offering the king some breathing room should a flank attack materialize. Shifting the knight to the rim often signals a desire to attack the kingside or clear a path for other pieces, but it also relinquishes control of central squares and potentially creates weaknesses. Observe how this knight's journey impacts pawn structures and the safety of the monarchs as the game progresses. Safeguarding the monarch initiates a period of consolidation, aiming to secure a safe haven from potential incursions along the open diagonals and central files that are beginning to form. A strategic repositioning, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and potentially launch a queenside initiative. This knight rerouting subtly shifts defensive duties, freeing up the f6 square for future maneuverability while preparing to influence the d5 stronghold. Developing the bishop to a more active square, this piece aims to contest the dark squares and support a potential queenside expansion. Observe how it cooperates with the knight on c3, creating a subtle pressure that black must acknowledge to prevent positional weaknesses from festering. Liberating the d7 knight and opening a dynamic path towards white's kingside, this gambit seeks to disrupt the pawn structure and create immediate imbalances. Expect a sharp struggle as black aims to exploit the pawn sacrifice for active piece play. Unleashing a bold pawn storm, white aggressively challenges black's central control and aims to seize the initiative by opening lines for attacking play. Opening the central files with this pawn exchange, black boldly seeks to shatter white's imposing pawn wedge and activate their pieces, particularly the fianchettoed bishop. This thrust, however, simultaneously invites tactical skirmishes and potentially exposes the kingside if white reacts aggressively. It's a decisive moment where black gambles on creating imbalances to outmaneuver their opponent, trading material for dynamic potential, and a clearer path for their pieces into the white camp. Recapturing the pawn with the knight injects immediate dynamism, forcing black to confront the compromised central pawn structure and potentially open lines towards their king. Liberating the knight from its cramped outpost on h5, black initiates a crucial pawn chain exchange that aims to disrupt white's central grip and potentially open lines towards the kingside. This maneuver, while seemingly aggressive, carries a delicate balance, as it immediately creates potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure should white choose to capture and re-establish their own central control. The fluidity of the position is now paramount. Black must ensure their pieces can swiftly occupy the newly vacant squares and capitalize on any lingering inaccuracies in white's setup. Opening the bishop's diagonal promises to exert significant pressure down the c1h6 diagonal, challenging black's kingside pawn structure. Injecting a knight into the heart of white's camp presents an immediate tactical dilemma. Now white must decide if the central pawns are worth the potential disarray this aggressive knight might cause. Unifying the queen with the kingside defense, this maneuver aims to bolster the weak f4 pawn and prepare for potential king safety maneuvers, while also eyeing the open files that might materialize later in the game. The intention here is to prepare the pawn lever, b5, a fundamental counterstrike against white's central buildup and space advantage, aiming to destabilize the queenside and create an outpost for black's pieces. Suddenly, the bishop on h3 finds a surprisingly active post, eyeing the kingside and creating immediate pressure along the open diagonal, potentially disrupting black's intended queenside expansion by forcing a decision regarding the f5 pawn. Positioning the bishop on the diagonal opens up possibilities for controlling the c6 square and potentially supporting a later push of the b-pawn, while simultaneously freeing the knight on e5 to explore active squares or prepare for a defensive role should the center crack open. Opening the e-file immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to activate white's rooks, potentially leading to rapid development and a swift attack on the king's side. A bold declaration of intent, this capture immediately throws open the kingside, forcing a decisive confrontation and creating a potentially dynamic pawn structure where black hopes to exploit the newly formed g-file. Shifting the rook to the open e-file immediately pressures black's undeveloped queenside and sets the stage for potential pawn pushes that could cramp black's style. The queen embarks on a journey, seeking active squares and possibly preparing to contest the open e-file or swing over to the kingside. This repositioning hints at a desire to equalize the pawn structure's limitations and engage white's pieces more directly, rather than passively defending. Grasping the initiative on the d-file now, this knight redeployment aims to reroute the pieces through the center, potentially supporting a d5 push or bolstering the kingside defense against black's encroaching queenside play. The queen's repositioning to g6 seeks to pressure the h3 bishop and potentially reinforce the f5 pawn, but it leaves the e6 square vulnerable to potential knight outposts after white's inevitable central pawn pushes. Shifting the knight to e3 initiates a strategic realignment, preparing to potentially challenge black's central pawn structure or reroute the knight for an attack on the queenside. This repositioning also aims to bolster white's control over key central squares, particularly f5 and d5, while simultaneously offering potential for a kingside pawn push if the opportunity arises. Unlocking the e-file presents a tangible attacking avenue, aiming to pierce white's pawn shield and destabilize the kingside structure. The rooks now stand poised to collaborate and exploit potential weaknesses. A bid for central influence, this queen maneuver aims to bolster the d-pawn and potentially launch an assault on the kingside by connecting the rooks and creating a more active battery along the second rank. With the queen venturing to h5, black aims to create immediate pressure on the weakened kingside, perhaps eyeing potential tactical skirmishes involving the g2 bishop and the f4 knight. This aggressive sortie injects a dynamic element, challenging white's seemingly solid pawn structure and centralized pieces to justify their positioning. The move forces white to carefully consider their defensive setup, as any misstep could expose the monarch to swift retribution, transforming the current positional struggle into a sharp tactical affair where piece activity and initiative will be paramount. It's a declaration of intent, signaling that black is no longer content with passive development and is ready to engage in a decisive battle for control and advantage. Repositioning the bishop back to g2 aims to solidify the kingside and prepare for potential pawn breaks or maneuvers along the light squares. A clever retrenchment after the active, but perhaps slightly premature f4 gambit. Bringing the rook to the 7th rank now initiates a subtle pressure on white's king's side, preparing to exploit potential weaknesses along the open file and in the pawn structure around g3, while simultaneously unblocking the bishop on g7 for potential future activity. White's initiative gains significant traction by challenging black's queenside structure, aiming to pry open lines that could exploit the less developed pieces and create attacking pathways toward the king. This maneuver signals an intent to disrupt black's defensive solidity and seize the initiative on the flank, potentially forcing weaknesses that can be exploited later. Black's maneuver to reinforce the kingside pawns with b6 acknowledges white's looming pressure on the queenside, aiming to prevent a decisive pawn breakthrough like b5. This move, however, signals a subtle shift in focus, potentially sacrificing queenside space to solidify defensive structures. The long-term implications of this commitment might involve challenges in developing queenside counterplay and could leave black's own queenside somewhat cramped. Initiating a pawn sacrifice to pry open the queenside, white seeks to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and expose weaknesses. This aggressive pawn grab aims to activate the queenside pawns and potentially create an outpost for white's pieces, particularly the queen and rooks, while simultaneously challenging black's pawn shield. By forcing the exchange on c5, white is deliberately inviting tactical complications, hoping to exploit any miscalculations from black's side in the ensuing exchanges. This dynamic move sacrifices material for initiative, aiming to prevent black from consolidating their position, and instead forcing them to react defensively to white's spatial gains. The capture of the pawn on c5 is a calculated risk to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's rooks on the semi-open b-file. Opening the c-file with this pawn push is a bold decision, immediately creating dynamic imbalances and challenging white's central control. The strategic aim here is to activate the rook on c8 and potentially create weaknesses in white's pawn structure on the queenside, aiming for a more open game where black's pieces can find active squares. This maneuver seeks to exploit the fact that white's queen on c2 might become exposed to threats along the newly opened file. Tactically, black is looking to gain a tempo by forcing white to respond to the immediate pressure on the c-file, potentially disrupting white's plans. The geometric implications are significant. The pawn exchange creates a more fluid board, potentially leading to tactical skirmishes. Emboldening the queen to the center, this maneuver aims to leverage white's central presence, potentially forcing concessions or creating targets on the queen side, while simultaneously eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Embracing the center with this rook, black simultaneously adds pressure along the e-file, challenging white's control and preparing for potential exchanges that could alleviate the cramped queen side. Repositioning the knight towards the king side, the intention is likely to bolster the attack and potentially eye the weak f5 pawn, while also clearing the path for other pieces. Black's pawn push on the queenside aims to disrupt white's intended central space advantage and potentially create counterplay on the flank, though it does leave the queenside somewhat weakened and could invite white's knights to exploit open lines later. A prudent step to shield the monarch, this maneuver aims to forestall any immediate threats on the kingside diagonals, particularly by the black bishop currently eyeing g7, and prepares for potential pawn advances like g4 in the future, offering a much-needed sense of security. Initiating an ambitious pawn thrust on the queenside, this maneuver aims to pry open lines and create immediate pressure against white's potentially vulnerable king's flank. A bold attempt to rip open the queenside, challenging black's pawn structure and aiming to exploit potential weaknesses around the exposed black king. Shifting the queen's gaze from the kingside to the queenside hints at a desire to contest white's expanding pawn storm, a subtle repositioning for potential counterplay along the now open queenside files. Sharpness returns to the board with white seizing the file, creating immediate threats against black's queenside. A valiant attempt to pry open the queenside, but black desperately needs to address the looming threats around his king and the exposed central pawns that white's queen and knights are already eyeing. This maneuver to try and activate the bishop on the long diagonal, while seemingly logical, neglects the immediate defensive requirements, and could lead to a rapid collapse if white seizes the initiative in the center. Securing the monarch against any potential discovered checks or sacrifices on the g-file is a prudent defensive measure, especially with the opponent's bishop pair eyeing open diagonals and an active queen. Trading off the bishop here relinquishes black's most active piece, the one that was eyeing white's kingside structure and poised to exploit the weakened dark squares. Unleashing the g-file, white creates a glaring pathway directly at the enemy king, transforming the position from a positional grind into a sharp, dynamic battle where attacking prowess takes center stage. Shattering the pawn shield, the knight plunges into the enemy's heartland, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and exploit the now open lines leading towards the monarch. This audacious thrust immediately creates serious tension, forcing white to reevaluate their defensive setup and potentially abandon their current piece alignment. The knight's presence on d3 offers dynamic attacking possibilities, potentially creating threats against f2 or even indirectly pressuring the d-file, while simultaneously freeing up other black pieces for more active roles. White must tread carefully, as this knight can prove a highly disruptive force if not addressed with precision. Unleashing the rook onto the 7th rank immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens a vital path toward the king. The rook now occupies the vital open file, presenting a direct challenge to white's doubled pawns and offering potential support for black's central pawn pushes later. Targeting the d3 knight with the queen effectively creates a multi-pronged threat, forcing black into a reactive posture and seeking to exploit the awkward placement of the knight, which could become a liability if its support structure erodes. The rook slides into the fray, seeking to exploit white's potentially vulnerable central pawns and create immediate pressure on the 2nd rank. Unleashing a forceful queen check, white aggressively probes the newly opened diagonal towards black's king, aiming to disrupt its precarious safety and exploit the lingering weakness on g6 after the pawn capture. Unleashing the bishop to h6 opened up critical diagonals, and its repositioning to e8 now aims to solidify the f7 pawn's defense while preparing for potential counterplay along the 3rd rank, aiming to disrupt white's battery on the queen's diagonal. A courageous attempt to consolidate the center and shield the monarch, though it leaves the c-pawn vulnerable to further pressure. Black abandons the defense of the e-pawn, a bold decision that opens fascinating tactical possibilities and drastically shifts the game's character. Instead of reinforcing, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create an immediate threat on the c-file, potentially forcing white into a defensive posture. This commitment to activity could prove decisive if white isn't vigilant, but it also leaves the king somewhat exposed to potential counterplay along the open lines. Unleashing a hidden bishop, this maneuver aims to shatter black's defensive shell, capitalizing on the exposed black king by opening lines of attack down the g-file and potentially the newly created h-file. Unleashing a surprising knight fork creates immediate chaos around the white king, forcing a drastic reshuffling of defenses.